The Game Boy Advance may have one of the greatest libraries of any console, handheld or otherwise, but the screen sucks. It's hard to see even in the best light, and it doesn't have a particularly high refresh rate either. Much of this was solved by the release of the front-illuminated GBA SP in 2003, but if you've held one of those recently, you might have noticed that its form factor is optimized for what I would call baby hands. Not to even mention the Game Boy Micro, which, though adorable, isn't exactly practical either. But modern IPS screens are cheap, bright, and energy efficient, so if you prefer the form factor of the original GBA and you're willing to do a bit of tinkering, you might be surprised by how easy it is to modernize that 20-year-old handheld in your closet. Stick around, I'll show you how to do it yourself for cheap, and why you might want to reconsider buying one pre-built online. First of all, to start off, you're going to need a screen, and that's more complicated than you might think. As of right now, there are currently two different third-party models on the market, both by the company Funny Playing. Yeah, can you tell they're Chinese by chance? The newer model is usually labeled as version 2 or 10 brightness levels, whereas the original won't have this distinction. While it's true that the new model supports adjustable brightness, the bigger issue is that the original model suffered from severe screen tearing issues and could overdraw from the AA batteries inside and cause the system to spontaneously power off. Yikes. Almost all the pre-modded GBA systems for sale on Etsy, eBay, or Amazon right now that are listed as AGS 101 actually use this buggy aftermarket screen and not Nintendo's OEM AGS 101 screen. And so I would highly recommend not going with a pre-built system unless it specifically says V2 in the title. Your luck may vary, but in my experience, these things have all sorts of inconsistent issues thanks to their cheap aftermarket parts, and I do not feel comfortable recommending any of them. That being said, if you already have an unmodded GBA from the early 2000s, you can save around $100 by installing a version 2 screen yourself, and know that it will be reliable since every other component inside was made by Nintendo. So let's get into that. I got my screen on eBay for around $40, and it also came with the necessary screwdrivers, a glass faceplate to replace the original GBA's plastic one, huge fan of that, and the necessary wires pre-cut for soldering the new screen's brightness controller to the Game Boy's PCB. The soldering is an entirely optional step, and you can do this mod without soldering anything if you prefer. Next, I purchased a replacement shell for $8 to spruce up the exterior of my old childhood GBA, but in retrospect, I actually messed up here. We'll get into why a little later. First, I took out the batteries, and using the supplied tri-wing screwdriver, took out all 6 screws from the back, plus the tiny Phillips head screw in the battery compartment. That let the back cover free and allowed the plastic sides and shoulder buttons to pop off. Then I unscrewed the 2 Phillips screws holding the PCB down, one on the far left and the other on the far right. That allowed the board to flip up and over the top of the system. Just be careful doing this since the screen's ribbon cable is still attached. This gave me access to the 2 power LEDs, and just for fun, I decided to cut away the original green power light labeled DL2 and replace it with some blue SMDs I had lying around. These types of lights are insanely tiny, so I wouldn't recommend going for this particular step without some previous soldering experience. I then folded the board back down and reinserted the batteries for a quick test of the blue power light. Nice. Moving on. The version 2 of the backlit screen actually comes in 2 parts that snap together. The screen itself, and then the screen's controller, which is actually printed on this ribbon cable. Wild. To get the original screen out, I just pulled this ribbon cable out of the socket on the PCB. There are tiny locks on the left and right side, but it's still a really snug fit. There we go. Nintendo actually redesigned the Game Boy Advance's internals halfway through its life, so your system might use a wide 42-pin connector, or the thinner and newer 32-pin connector. Either way, the backlit screen has interfaces for both sizes, so just plug in the one that fits for you and ignore the other. Mine is a launch edition GBA, so I needed the Fat Boy plug. I originally thought I broke my screen during the process, but as it turns out, the cable just wasn't inserted all the way. Pulling it out and plugging it back in again solved my issue, and I haven't had problems with it since. The screen itself attaches via a smaller connection at the bottom of the brightness controller. I quick tested the screen, and so far so good. Also, this is the perfect time to clean out your filthy speaker, you heathen. Now comes the part where I soldered wires from the GBA's PCB to the brightness controller of the new screen. you can completely skip this step if you don't mind losing out on adjustable brightness. Like I said, the screen has 10 levels of brightness, so if you don't solder anything, your screen will just always be at a brightness level of 5, which is also totally valid. If you want to go all in like me, here's how I did it. First, I threw some flux on the pad marked TP2 just above the start and select buttons, intended to make connecting these ultra thin wires a bit easier. Then I pinched the end of the wire between the pad and the head of the iron to weld it in place. Next, I did the same thing to the pad marked SEL on the screen's ribbon cable, and welded the other end of the wire there. Then, on the other side of the board, I did the same to the upper left pin in the group labeled SW3, where the R button would be, and connected that to the pad marked R on the ribbon cable. Last but not least, on the opposite end of the board, I connected the SW2 pin, where the L button would be, to the pad marked L on the ribbon cable. And just like that, the screen's controller will now be able to detect when the select button, L button, or R button are being pressed. I then attached the included insulative film to the back of the screen, and added electrical tape over the circuitry of the ribbon cable to prevent any potential shorts. Next, we need to get the screen seated in the console's faceplate. Remember how I said I messed up earlier? Well, this is why. Modern IPS screens are actually a bit bigger than the original non-backlit screen that shipped with the GBA. That means in order to get this screen to fit inside the shell, we're going to need to cut away some plastic, or in this case, melt it away. The actual adjustment is very minute. All you need is a little more space on the D-pad side of the cutout, so if you're planning on buying replacement shells already, it's definitely worth sourcing out a seller that offers the shell pre-cut to the shape of the V2 screen. All in all, a piece of adhesive is going to hold the screen in place, so as long as the cutout is big enough, the exact spacing does not matter at all. Otherwise, I would not be using a soldering iron to do a Dremel's job. I then applied the adhesive that came in the kit to the borders of the screen cutout, peeled the protective layer off the top of the screen, and laid it in place as close to the D-pad as possible. Next, the two Phillips head screws that hold the PCB to the back half of the shell went in, the buttons, power switch, and side panels went on, and the entire system was folded down on top of itself once again. I then turned the 6 tri-wing screws to their places in the back of the system, as well as the tiny Phillips screw in the battery compartment, and for the final step, peeled the backing off of the sticky glass faceplate and gave it its permanent new home. So, let's check out the results. I'm honestly extremely happy with the way this turned out. The project left me with brand new buttons, a new black shell, new blue power LED, and of course, a backlit IPS screen with adjustable brightness, all for around $50. By the way, here's an example of the brightness in action. You hold select and press L to lower it, and hold select and press R to raise it. And as you can see, it's perfectly capable of overexposing my camera sensor on the upper end. Not to mention the fact that this is a device in 2020 with a headphone jack. Obviously, the intent of this video was not to dissuade anyone from getting a Game Boy with an IPS screen. Quite the contrary, in fact. All I'm saying is to be a smart shopper. Look carefully at the listings for these things, read customer reviews, and weed out the sellers that artificially inflate their feedback with 5-star ratings from bots. If you find a fantastic deal on a pre-modded GBA at a low price, first ask yourself why it's been marked down that low in the first place. And if a listing doesn't mention a V2 screen or adjustable brightness levels, skip it. Otherwise, you're likely to end up with a $200 lemon. I don't have a ton of experience doing hardware modifications at the component level, but found this to be a mostly chill and easy to follow process. So if you like tinkering like I do, I certainly recommend taking the plunge. Hope this video has been a pleasure. Thanks for watching.